Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 66, Adios Muchachos, by Daniel Chavarria. Hello, Point Blank listeners. Welcome back to the show. My name is Kurt, and joining me once again, here's Justin.
Hey, Kurt. Hello, listeners. Long time no chat.
Yes, sorry, everybody. It has been slow getting out these episodes, but that's the reality of life for Kurt and Justin right now. But thank you for sticking around with us and listening to the show. I can see that, from the downloads, you're still all out there and hopefully enjoying our limited shows that we put out. But I did, right before we get going and before I forget, I want to do a shout out, thank a couple listeners for giving reviews. I know we had a very positive review in the in iTunes in Ireland. However, I cannot figure out how to actually read what they said. I can only see that it was a 5-star review, so thank you. And then I want to thank Telegram Sam 55 for giving us a nice, fair review on iTunes. We really do appreciate those reviews. And, sometimes it feels like we make this thing, we throw it out into the ether, and who knows if anybody listens or enjoys. So when we get that feedback, it does motivate me to continue on with the show and continue giving you new episodes to listen to.
Totally. I agree with that. It's not only that it motivates me and relieves me that there are listeners, it also inspires us to think about the program itself. And when we get, constructive critique or comments, it creates a conversation that we have about where the show's at and where we want it to go. So we do incorporate the thoughts of our listeners, and we want you to, be reassured that if you do comment, thoughtfully, we're going to be listening and thinking about it, taking it seriously.
We have our style of show, and it's not like some other podcasts out there, but we keep going, we keep plugging along, and we are here today to talk about, we started out to talk about Cuban Noir.
Actually, it was going to be a Caribbean noir to start, and we kept narrowing it down to the point that we ended up with a singular author in Cuba. But we threw a big wide net all over the Caribbean basin, and then we ended up with one sardine, which was Daniel Chavarria's Adios Muchachos. But it was such a cool area to think about in terms of noir.
It really was, Justin. But casting that net, that is sort of the state of our fisheries today. But we would have a limited catch. But no, there's a lot of good work out there, and we did just for the sake of, for time, really, had to narrow it down to essentially one book and take a look at this one. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. I think, is there anything non-book related, Justin, you want to talk about before we get at it?
No, before we dive into Daniel's book, I want to talk about some of the other books that I was considering, but otherwise, no, I'm here in Albuquerque. It's the beginning of summer. We're kind of out of the pandemic for now, and that's great. I'm back to writing. I guess I will say that I attended the Left Coast Conference, which was held in Albuquerque in April, and served on a panel for Hardboiled writers, and that was great. I got to meet with some writers and chat about crime fiction, but I'm also going to be reviewing some of their works, those panelists that I was working with on that panel at the end of the show. So it's a way of just touching base with what happened in April, and so that's a 5-round burst that we haven't done in quite a while.
Yeah, and you reminded me of something. It's been so long since we recorded that since not since the last episode came out, but since we recorded last, I got COVID, and while I wasn't like that sick, it did drain my energy for almost a month. So
yeah,
it certainly set me behind. But yeah, feeling good now, and it does feel like things are at least a little bit going back to normal.
Yeah, I'm glad you've recovered, and looks like things are turning for you too in Seattle weather-wise.
Yes, for sure. Well, Justin, before we dive into the Cuban Noir that I know you want to discuss, I just will, throw this out there that it's unlike Adios Muchachos, unlike a lot of books that we cover, has a lot of sex in it, at least in the first half of the book. So just be aware of that. And there's also some, I don't think it's necessary. I don't know, Justin, tell me if you disagree with this. I don't necessarily know if it's disrespectful to trans folks in this book, but it's definitely dated.
Yeah.
And like taking that into consideration, there is a part, there is definitely a part that people might find
distasteful,
uncomfortable. Yeah, distasteful. Yeah. There's actually a racial element as well. And maybe we'll talk about that later. But just so you're aware of that in this book, I don't think it's prevalent throughout the whole book, but it definitely does feel dated.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
All right, so with that, let's grab a daiquiri, I guess, and talk about some Cuban Noir.
Yeah, totally. We proposed this idea many moons ago, and time travel is slow in Point Blanklandia, but the initial idea was to cast a wide net and think about the Caribbean and the Caribbean diaspora in terms of noir. And of course, the problem with that is there's just too much of it. There's much more than you'd think. Just looking at Haiti itself, you could probably, if you can translate the French, you probably come across so much good noir. If you look at Trinidad, you look at Jamaica, if you expand it to just crime rather than noir specifically, it gets even more overwhelming. So I came across a few authors from Cuba, and I got excited. What the hell's going on in Cuba in terms of crime fiction, and how do we think about crime in a nation that is notorious for having a different economic system and a worldview coming out of the Cold War with the rise of Castro and Cuban communism? What does crime fiction look like, and how do writers tackle crime? Is there even any? And the answer was very affirmingly, there's a lot, and some of it looks really good. So we and Kurt talked about some books and some authors. We settled on Daniel Chavarria, who's actually Uruguayan, but he emigrated to Cuba in the 1960s and lived there for 40 years. He sort of like Ernesto Che Guevara. He became Cuban through his investment in the country. But some other authors I was looking at. One of them is named Robert Arellano, who lives in the States, and he has a book that won an award called Havana Lunar, and the second book in that series is Habana Libre. And I was interested in this collection. The protagonist is a doctor, and I actually ended up reading Habana Libre, and I thought it was good. That second book, it was set in Miami, and there's tensions between this doctor and his dad, who escaped Cuba and became one of the leaders of like the right-wing Cuban diaspora population in Miami. Another author that I was interested in talking about for this show is named Arnaldo Correa, who's considered one of the godfathers of Cuban crime fiction. I actually struggled to find who the other godfathers were. I was told repeatedly in documentation that there were 3 godfathers of Cuban crime fiction, but I could never locate who they were. So if anybody knows the 3 names, I would love to know it. Anyway,
that would be helpful.
Yeah, it would. I kept typing it in. I'm like, Godfathers, Cuba, crime, noir, and I went for many hours, and I was unable to uncover it. So it is one of the prevailing mysteries. Anyway, it was cool, but I was worried because there's a lot of ways to go about this. What are we talking about when we're picking one book to represent a place? Arnaldo Correa writes a lot about spy espionage and the Cold War, and as much as I think that might be interested from Cuba's point of view, I didn't want to do another spy episode. We just did one like a few episodes back, so I said let's skip that one for now. Another guy was Jose Latour, who wrote a story called Outcast that looked really exciting, but I didn't pick that one. And the last person I was very curious about, and I actually started to read this book today. It's a guy named Leonardo Padura, and the book is called Havana Red, and it's part of a quadrilogy, 4 books, all featuring this inspector, Mario Conde, who is a sort of a thoughtful literary police inspector working for the Havana police in communist Cuba. And I think that would have been a great alternate choice to the book that we reviewed. And I think without even finishing the first book, I'm going to recommend that series for those who want to see detective fiction in Cuba, because it's really written beautifully and it captures Havana in all of its sweaty glory. So those are the books that I was excited about reading, and I wish I had more time to read them all. But I didn't. And we ended up with one that I would say is very interesting.
Yeah, I would say so, and we'll get into that in just a minute. I know when you brought this up to me, Justin, I was also just like, oh wow, this sounds like a really good topic, and I wish we had had the time and space to devote, dig deeply into this, and maybe that's something for another time when our lives are in a different place. But for now, it's just exciting to know that it's out there and be and something to dig through.
Totally.
Like we've said, yeah, and like what comes to mind here is again, you mentioned the richness of Cuba, but also the Caribbean as a whole for crime fiction and noir fiction is just every time we do this, where we go to a literature that is in another language, we find these hints that there is a rich crime fiction tradition, and yet we've not seen a lot of these works translated. And I guess that's just another push to get more of this work available in translation, so we can experience it in English and just bring it to a wider audience. So I would really encourage people to seek that out, and when publishers do these translations, I hope we can support it and show that there's a market for that work.
Totally. Even if we're looking at the book today, Adios Muchachos, that was put out by Akashic in like 2001, 2002. The fact is, Chavarria had been writing in Spanish for 25 years, and this was the first book in English that was released to an English audience. So there's much more of his work that we don't have access to. So when we do find something, it's a privilege and it's lucky, and thank you to translators. But there's much more than even we're able to uncover at this point.
Yeah, and I was going to bring this up later, but I'll throw it out now. It's his first book in translation, and it goes ahead and wins the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Paperback Original right away.
Yeah.
So clearly there's a lot of quality content out there.
Totally. And we're just, we're not scratching the surface. We're a little deeper than that, but consider this your Cuban Noir starter kit, the books that I mentioned, and I hope you enjoy our conversation about Adios Muchachos, because it's good. It's very good. It's very hard boiled. It's very pulp, and it's also very weird. And as Kurt said, sometimes unsettling in ways that imply a different sort of cultural understanding of topics that we discuss in crime fiction.
Yeah. So, I guess with that, Justin, maybe we should just go ahead and get on into it.
Sure.
Get on our bicycles.
Yeah, let's get on our bicycle, shake our ass and make it happen.
Woo!
All right, let me do my deep dive synopsis and review of this book, and then we'll talk about all the things we normally talk about. So, Adios Muchachos. This was written by the late Daniel Chavarria. As I said, he was born in Uruguay way back, and then he immigrated to Cuba in the 1960s. There are some stories, myths, arguments that he actually hijacked a plane from Colombia to get to Cuba, but he's also a notorious and consummate storyteller who might have planted some exaggerated tall tales to embellish his awesomeness. It's hard to say, but now I've spread the story. Share it with your friends. He actually, that's pretty cool or sketchy depending on how you see plane hijacking, but he actually remained in Cuba until his death in 2008. And he wasn't just a crime writer or a writer. He taught at the University of Havana. He taught Greek and Latin classics. So he was a lit professor and an aficionado of prostitutes. He says this very openly. So
yes, he does.
Yes, he does. So Adios Muchachos was, I stand corrected. I said it was 2001. It was actually 1994, published by Akashic in 94. And as Kurt said, it won an Edgar. And the heart of this story is a young woman named Alicia who, due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is, the early 90s, she's curtailed all of her big plans to attend university and marry some kind of communist bureaucrat because that world was over. They'd entered the big transition in Cuba. And to make ends meet, Alicia, with the help of her mother Margarita, has taken to perfecting what we'll call the art of seduction. And this is the opening sentence. When Alicia decided to become a bicycle hooker, her mother agreed to sell a ring that had been in the family for 5 generations. So that's the setup. Bicycle hooker is apt to a large extent. And the first quarter of this book showcases how Alicia goes about sort of playing this con. We get an insider look at her techniques, including the short shorts she wears, the bike she rides with the fake broken pedal, to create situations where wealthy tourists, men, can't help but stop their cars to run over and help the sexy lady with the broken bike. It's obviously a setup that she perfects, and we see it over and over again as it's explained at the beginning of the book in a way that's really fun. It's like a fun, comic, corny, sexy sort of introduction to what turns out to be a crime novel. Later, we learn how Alicia moves to step B and C and D as she lures these men into her house. Her mother plays an important role, cooking a certain type of shrimp. Margarita shows them she plays them a guitar song and shows them a sexy nude painting of her body in a bedroom. Everything's set up so like strategically to impel these men into intercourse and romance in a way that they end up giving Alicia and Margarita things that they need, material things like dishwashers and refrigerators and stuff like that. Does she take money? No, because she doesn't see herself as a prostitute. She thinks of money as debasing, and it doesn't work in her overall scheme, which is far deeper than simply exchanging sex for money. So this is the setup we get early on so that we understand where Alicia is coming from. And it really gives us some kind of economic and historical context into what Cuba was like at the time. Things were rough. Cubans were struggling to make ends meet because supply lines were cut off, and the Soviet Union wasn't there to be the big brother that kept things, operating relatively smoothly compared to the 90s. So this is the setup. But then that changes when we meet the second, I guess, major character, a guy named Victor King. He's a diver, supposedly. He's under contract with this huge Dutch conglomerate that's looking to find galleons that are sunk offshore of Cuba and go and dig up and all the treasure and make a huge profit off of the treasure. So there's this whole nest of essentially wealthy capitalists who are looking to take advantage of this enterprise. And Victor has his own games to play. He's a schemer in his own right, and he plays them when he sees Alicia right away. She does her trick, and Victor stops for her with the broken pedal. She attempts to seduce him, but he turns the tables and actually ends up seducing her in a sense, because like knows like. They're sort of peas in a pod. And ultimately, this leads to him actually hiring Alicia to lure a series of lovers into the bedroom of his estate for the voyeuristic gratification of his wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth's mysterious. We don't really see her early on. And they watch the action, Victor and Elizabeth, from behind a two-way mirror as Alicia seduces these other men. And it's just sort of a sexual gratification for Elizabeth and Victor. So this happens, and this is the first moment where this novel really sort of shifts into a different kind of space. We sort of leave Havana behind and enter this boudoir bedroom situation. But then once we get to the halfway point, the novel takes a pretty major turn. What started as a playful, comic, seductive, one-manship story becomes a murder, cover-up, kidnap conspiracy. I'm not going to spoil the con or really dive into all the specifics, but this detour is pretty significant for me. It changed the feel of the book. It shows the complicated dynamics of Victor and Alicia before and after this unexpected death that happens, and this death is what leads them to come up with this kidnapping scheme, because all of their all of Alicia's typical ways of making money, the seduction ploy, and then the way that she makes money with Victor, it all sort of comes to a crashing halt because of this new situation. So they scheme to try to make $4 million off of this murder. And I would say that things get complicated pretty quickly, and there's a lot of players that we'll talk about. But I want to talk briefly about the primary manipulations in this novel, just to show you the kind of novel it is. It's all about scheming up onesmanships and people who feign, who they are, how they present themselves to others, in a way that's pretty funny for the most part. We have Alicia, with the help of her mother, seducing and manipulating foreign tourists. We have Victor manipulating Alicia, offering her a position to work for him and his wife, Elizabeth. We have this guy named Jan van Dongen, who manipulates Victor when he learns that Victor isn't who he says he is. We have Victor manipulating everybody when it is revealed at the halfway point that his wife isn't who she says she is. And then the two master manipulators, Alicia and Victor, come together to manipulate everyone when they set up a fake kidnapping to try to make $4 million. So it's just one thing after another in a way that's almost jarring. Suffice it to say, I preferred the first half of the book more than the second half. That was my take. I liked watching Alicia do her thing, and I liked being on the streets of Havana. I did feel like the novel became more of a heist novel, and almost like James M. Cain's Postman Only Rings Twice in the second half. It reminded me of another author, Vicki Hendricks, who wrote a Cain-like novel called Miami Purity, which came out in 1995. And I wondered if she actually read Chavarria's work before she wrote her own. Nonetheless, the verdict is this. I think this is a sexy, fun, steamy novel. The spotlight is on Havana, especially at the beginning, and it's from an actual socialist Cuban writer instead of a visiting voyeur or white tourist writer, which is cool. It's not a perfect book. Sometimes it feels like two books. But if you want to see Cuba in the 1990s, like I did, and if you want a novel with lots of sex and sex appeal, or if you just want to see what happens when two Class A cons meet and conspire, because that's what happens when we get Alicia and Victor together, then this might work for you. I would say I wanted to almost give it 3 stars at first, but I've decided I'm going to give it 3.5 out of 5 hits for this novel. I think it's good, but not great. That's my take, Kurt. What do you think?
Ooh, interesting. It's a lower rating than I would have expected from you. Well, I enjoyed this novel. I didn't know what to expect, but I thought it was fun. I thought it did surprise me in some ways that I wasn't expecting. I think that I have not read a whole, like, as you said, there is definitely 2 distinct, phases in this novel. It could almost be 2 books. And that first half, I think, is really strong. It's almost like erotica meets con story. But yeah, the elaborate description of how Alicia and her mother set up this whole network it's really actually quite fascinating and well written, actually.
Yeah.
And I was surprised by that. I kind of thought when it started and it was going down that track, I was like, oh boy, what am I getting into here? But no, I think that Daniel here does a pretty good job of writing this. That shows not only the level of the con going on here, but also in a way of how sex work is work. All of the stuff that Alicia and her mom do to make these situations happen. And ultimately in a way that's like, yeah, there is a little bit of a Pretty Woman sort of element to this.
Sure.
In that it does it does glorify sex work in a way that is probably only true for I don't know. I'm guessing only true for a small percentage of sex workers. And that's something to be aware of. I do think that maybe, the way that Alicia is portrayed here is not how you would expect. Now, when it comes to the kidnapping, I do agree with you that it's a little, it does remove Havana. I mean, the rest of the story could take place anywhere in the world. It really isn't very Havana specific. And I do think that is a lacking part of the narrative. I do think it's also kind of fun in it's comedic. It's low-key comedic in what goes wrong and how elaborate the setup is and all that sort of thing. It's not as comedic as something like Florida Noir is. But, you know, somebody I would think of is a little bit of Elmore Leonard elements here. So ultimately, I enjoyed the book, and I think I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5.
Yes, we deviated, finally.
And I, you know, knowing you and knowing some of the because I made connections to Florida Noir, and I know that how you feel about that, that may be one reason why your score is a little bit lower. If I have one note, it's like we have this wonderful idea of this whole shipwreck business going on. It's brought up in a couple of bits, and I would have liked to have seen a lot more of that.
I'm shocked.
Now, I'm
absolutely floored that you would want to get out there into the boats and see shit.
It's a note.
Yes.
But yeah, overall, really, I mean, I found the book a good read. I would, you know, seeing as the season that we're recording this, like, I think this is a great beach read kind of novel. And I had a lot of fun with it. So I'm going to give it a pretty strong 4.
I think that's a totally fair take on it. I want to add one note. I just did some reading on my notes, and I saw that apparently it was published by Akashic in 2001. So maybe it came out in Spanish in 94 and on Akashic in 2001.
I think that's the case.
Okay.
Spanish in 94, yeah.
I totally agree with you about the galleons and the sunken Spanish boats. Like, I would have loved to get out there and see something go wrong in that way. It's one of those red herrings. What's this book going to be about? At first is obviously Alicia is setting us up for something to go wrong because everything about her system is perfect. So something has to come and mess that up. And Victor is that guy. But then after that, Chavarria could have taken the book in a lot of different directions. He chose to go in this kind of heist direction, which is fine. But yeah, I would have loved to get on the water. But you know, I'm a water nut too, and that got me thinking about Charles Williams, and maybe want to actually reread Charles Williams now that it's summer. And I haven't read one of his books since Scorpion Reef or something way back. So
it's always a good time to recommend Charles Williams.
Yeah, exactly.
Should we dive right into the characters in this book?
I think we should. There's actually quite a few characters.
There is. Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly tight narrative, but we do get exposed to quite a few characters. And I guess, should we start off with Alicia and Victor, or should we come back to them?
We should probably start with them because everything, all the other characters sort of revolve around these two sons.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess I'll start off with Alicia then. So she's essentially our main character here. She, as you say, she's the bike prostitute who is really trying to, well, for lack of a better term, she's really trying to land a sugar daddy, right?
Yeah.
She's looking for a man who can get her out of Cuba, set her up well, and she wants the money. That's really what she's after. Is portrayed as really, you know, as long as she finds something attractive about the man, she is a willing participant in this endeavor, and she's just after the big fish and willing to go to great lengths to find that fish. You know, I do like her as a character. I think the author gives her a fair bit of agency here, but I don't really know that she develops a whole lot during the course of the book. And the other thing I would say about her is that for me as a reader, she's a little bit too willing of a participant in some elements of the plot, and particularly in the latter half of the book, that transition seems almost too easy. That I guess I feel like Victor should have had to sell her on that a little bit harder.
Yeah, that's a good point, because and that's that whole this feels like two books phenomenon, because we get a sense of who she is. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of character development, but there's a lot of coloring. We really get a good sense of how Alicia's day-to-day works now. And we also know that it isn't just that she's hoping for a sugar daddy. She has like a lot of potential suitors right now. She has an Argentinian, an Italian. She has these men sort of waiting in the wings who, if she plays her cards right, might, you know, the Italian wants her to like some Italian anarchist who makes $150,000 a year, wants her to move to Italy. And she's like, well, he's a little fat. Like, she's starting to scrutinize it a little more. She has a guy in Argentina. So when she gets to the position where Victor's like, this is our way to make some money, we're not going to be able to do the old system. Essentially, you're going to be cut off. She could always say, "Oh, fuck this! I'm not going to get involved with this. This is too much," and go to Plan B or Plan C, which is back to her other life, which seemed to be working. So you're right. The fact that she decided to jump in full on with the heist was a little bit of a leap for her character, and we never see her struggle or contemplate or chew on it in a way that has any depth. And that's what makes this book particularly pulpy. It's really just about, let's give them a crime and then laugh at how things go wrong. So it's very, very surface, I think, especially in that second half.
Yeah, that's a good point. And to that point, that it being pulpy, the death that occurs in here is like a lot of pulp things. The death is an accident, and had they handled that situation differently, or more reasonably, we wouldn't have a book. But
yeah, or at least not this book. It'd be something else.
But yeah, so I guess that's a critique of that, how that Alicia is written.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, I mean, for as far as in the realm of female protagonists that we've looked at in this show, I'd say pretty well written.
Yeah, she's sexually liberated. She develops the scheme on her own. She's not being manipulated into some kind of sexual trafficking. She is her own person. She works in with her mother on this. Her mother endorses the scheme because of circumstances. This is a sort of a pulpy socialist realism novel dealing with the ramifications of a crashed economy. The desperate times call for desperate measures, and they take advantage. What about Margarita, the mother? Did you? We don't get a lot of her, but did you like her okay as like a secondary character?
Yeah. No, I liked Margarita quite a bit. And I think that relationship between Alicia and her mother is really important to the story and to the development of Alicia as a character, because Margarita's point of view and sort of endorsement of this whole scheme makes a lot of sense when we know the history of Margarita. Briefly, the story there is that Alicia, Margarita, and her father, whose name is not really important, but he was a diplomat of sorts for Cuba. They traveled around the world. He had some money. At the same time, he was also cheating on his wife regularly, and she found out about it. She started cheating on her husband, and then he had a problem with that and divorced her. And, Margarita's position is sort of like, well, you got to watch out for yourself. You got to take care of yourself, because it's going to be a double standard in your life, or from a lot of men, they're going to treat it as a double standard. There does seem to be, and this isn't really articulated in the novel, but I projected it on here, that Margarita's endorsement of using her daughter and her younger daughter, Alicia, to gain this wealth was also a little bit of trying to capture this former life that she had as a global traveler, and going to parties and having a lot of things that my guess is the average Cuban person is not going to have access to.
Yeah, this is interesting because it's not the classic story often told in American crime set in Cuba about the pre-1959 Cuba, which was all unfettered capitalism and extravagance and gangsterism and hotel parties. And then the Great Fall, and then everybody eating beans and rice and crying. This was more of what Cuba was like as a bureaucratic socialist state, and who benefited from that. There was still a hierarchy. Those in power, those close to power, technocrats and whatnot, were able to live a relatively well-to-do, glamorous life, but that failed. That was lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We were back down to no economy, and those who had special privileges lost those privileges in the same way that the capitalists lost their privileges in 1959. So it's a kind of history repeating itself in an interesting way.
Yeah, and it's interesting also to put that, what you just said, in context with the idea that Chavarria was, a very strong supporter of the revolution from his early, as a young man, all the way to his death. And I wonder, it would be interesting to have a Cuban who is savvy to what things are said sort of between the lines in Cuban politics, and have them read this.
Yes.
And what is being said here that we as Americans who are not, don't understand that, what are we not getting out of this novel? Because I suspect that there's a lot of things being said in here that I'm not processing.
Yeah, like twice, because it's lost in translation twice. The hidden of avoiding the communist censors, but then translating from Spanish to English. How much of the nuance is gone?
And it's interesting because Chavarria is a supporter of it, but yet, like, his characters in this novel are, I wouldn't say they're disillusioned, but they're not exactly strong supporters of the party or the revolution. And in fact, what they're ultimately seeking is to leave Cuba. So I don't know if there's some commentary there that, again, I don't get. But I mean, it's just interesting. There's layers in here. And I guess for me, anyway, that's like what kind of thinking about that is what sort of brought my rating up a little bit.
Yeah.
Even if I don't understand it, it's interesting to think about.
Totally. And I think that's a good point. And one that I was deeply curious about when we started thinking about Cuban Noir. To what extent are we seeing a genuine picture of Cuba? To what extent does propaganda dictate how the story is written? I mean, the same thing could be said about capitalist realism, which is what we get a lot of now in crime fiction in the United States. But I was surprised to find there was a tolerance for disillusionment in the crime fiction from Cuba that I'm reading in the 90s. Like you said, these characters, they're not wearing olive colored fatigues and talking about Russia with sparkles in their eyes. They're just trying to get by. This could be set in Nevada, and I would understand these characters similarly. I mean, in the sense that they're human. They're human, and they're in dire straits, and they're trying to take advantage. This is more of a humanistic story rather than an ideological story.
Yes. Well, should we move on to Victor?
Yeah, we have to. He looks like Mel Gibson.
Yeah, we hear that repeatedly. Yeah. Victor, to me, I feel like he almost should have been, he's hard to place because on the one hand, he's a good con artist. He supposedly robbed some banks in the past. He has a cover name. He's recreating himself in Cuba. What's interesting to me, and I wish I'd heard more about, is that he's conducting these crimes so that he has money to search for these sunken shipwrecks. There's points in the story where he's almost, he goes from being manipulative and like con artisty and becomes more conniving and almost whiny. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure quite what to make of that.
I mean, I'll just be blunt. I didn't really care for him. He served a function in the story, but I didn't like his narrative. He wasn't really a person. He was a mirage. He changes names and positions and stories to suit his own ends. But so yeah, I guess I didn't really try to understand him because I didn't think there was much to understand other than he's like a few moments in the story he was able to serve like a gotcha moment for Alicia. Like, oops, just kidding. This changes the narrative and redirects us. And that happens 2 or 3 times with him being the guy who propels it.
That's fair, yeah.
But that's not good. That's not a character thing. That's more Victor King as plot device.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I'm reacting to is that, yeah, I feel like he is a plot device and not really, he acts how he needs to suit to further the plot at any given point in the book.
Yeah, exactly. He's like
and now
get out of jail free card. When something goes wrong, let's give Victor King another, storyline that he can develop.
So, okay, well, moving into more of the secondary characters, who do you find most interesting there?
Oh boy. Whenever the bad guys come together, I tend to just glaze over and skim. And I did that when I read it, and I did it when I listened to it on tape. I'm like, oh, fast forward. We have Hendrix Groot. His name is Reeks Groot. This is Victor's Dutch business boss. We learn this is a key part of the story. I don't know how much I want to give away, so I'll just say that when Reeks Groot is in the position of being the Dutch business boss, he's just a suit. He's just a sort of a rich suit, and I never really thought much of him. We have his brother who doesn't want to get involved with the galleon scheme. He thinks it's sketchy. And then we have Jan Van Dongen, who's the kind of, refer to him as Groot's pit bull, who supports Victor in the galleon project. And later on serves a function of finding out Victor's secret, the secret about Victor's past, which I'm not revealing. And then he's involved with some girl named Camille, or that I didn't never actually understood that narrative exactly. And then lastly, we have, of course, Elizabeth, Victor's mysterious wife. Those are the characters that I wrote down. Are there any I'm missing?
Nah, that's pretty much it.
I didn't answer your question. Which one of these guys, people did I like? None of them. I read this book for Alicia.
That's fair. I mean, I asked that. It's kind of a loaded question because you're right. Like, there really not a lot of development there. I mean, I think the most interesting character is probably Elizabeth because of the mystery that's there.
Yes.
But still, even considering that, we don't really hear from Elizabeth that much in the book.
No.
The business parts of it are pretty weak. And I'm gonna say one of my annoying things that I find that writers do is, even though there's really only one chapter, I think, where this is kind of confusing, but when you have a small cast, why do you have two characters named Victor and Vincent that you then also refer to as Vic and Vince?
Yeah, maybe that's lost in translation. I don't know.
If that's true, and he's not the only author to do this, but why? Why do you do that? I don't know.
He wanted to challenge the author. He wanted to challenge the readership, give you a little extra homework.
I guess. I mean, they're not even, like, it might make more sense if they were brothers, and, like, my brother's name is a little bit like mine, but, like, they're not related. So why do that? Authors, please don't do that.
Don't do that, says Kurt.
Yes, unless there's a really, really good reason. There's a lot of characters, but really only 2 or 3 that matter.
Yeah, I think that's really it. And I'm okay with it because, again, this is, as the quote on the book was, pulp fiction set in Havana. So I'm willing to accept what this book is trying to be. Regarding Elizabeth, yes, she's mysterious. She is always behind a closed door. We hear of her. I'm okay with this. We're supposed to, obviously there's going to be some kind of reveal. I didn't know what it was going to be. We're not going to spoil it, but it's a surprise that changes the story pretty completely. I would say, but I guess I'm trying to, like, address some things without addressing them in a way that I feel is just totally pointless. So I'm just going to stop there. Because any further, and I'm going to give some things away. So, what about the writer's craft? How did you feel about the writing of this book, or at least the translation that we read?
I think the writing is much stronger in the first half of the book than the second half of the book. I mean, what we know from Chavarria's background, seeing as he is essentially, or proclaims himself to be a historian of prostitution, he clearly cares a lot about that topic and writes rather eloquently about the whole situation. And that is definitely the strength of the book. I mean, not only is it a good explanation of that, but it's a good explanation of a con in general. The writing, when it switches to the second half of the book and the kidnapping plot and all of that, it gets a little bit hokey at times, and a little bit too, I forget how I've described this in the past, but sometimes in crime fiction novels and pulpy novels, I need to come up with a term for this, but where the characters spend too much time explaining to each other the steps they're going to take to pull off some action.
A little bit of exposition and dialogue. They talk to each other so that we also see it, but then they carry it out so we see it. So it does feel like a little bit of, they're not creating the space for the reader to fill in the blanks themselves in a way that can slow down a book. And I think that was the problem with the second half. It didn't feel captivating. It started to feel like a technical manual for how to pull off a scheme, which I don't need.
Well, and I think where there's a real stark difference there is that in the first half of the book, we're very very beautifully shown how this con is pulled off. And there's a narrative involved, and it's like we're shown all of this. I felt very immersed in it and whatnot. And then in the second half of the book, I didn't see that same level of care in the writing. So I guess that's a fairly decent critique.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if maybe he got some editorial notes about where the book was going and was encouraged to give it more of a traditionally plotted crime fiction feel. Who knows? I don't, but it made me wonder.
I always feel like it's hard to talk about craft when we're talking about a translated novel.
Yep.
Because I never know. You don't know how much of it is on the translator and how much is it on the original author.
Exactly, and so we need to go back to Spanish school, buddy.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, you need to go back. I need to start.
Yes. See, so when New York Times published an article about Chavarria in 2001, they said a couple things that were interesting. One, they asked this question. The most intriguing mysteries swirling about Daniel Chavarria are not in his crime novels, but his life. How does a professor of Latin and Greek classics find fulfillment and fame writing about prostitutes? Why does he live in Cuba, where some people whisper that he arrived 33 years ago on a hijacked flight? And how can he slam back 4 double shots of smooth amber rum before noon and not fall flat on his face? Then they quote him, and he here explains sort of his process for how he writes. He says, and this is classically Marxist, he goes, "My only absolute is the dialectic," he said, sometime before his third double shot. "I believe in contradictions. The world we live in is bipolar, where something happening in one place has the opposite effect somewhere else." And the implication here is that he likes to bring this kind of energy to his fiction. And I think we can see some of that in this book, and I'd like to imagine that we see some of it going forward in the next book in the series. I think it's called like Tango with a Torturer or something.
So in his chronology of books, this is sort of in the middle. After this one in 1999 comes out that year in Madrid, and then 2001 is Tango for a Torturer, and then the rest of his books have not been translated. So I'm not really sure what they're about.
Yes. So, well, remains to be seen. So, yeah, I like this. I think that if I had to choose again, well, I can't really say that until I read the other books, but I like Chavarria, and I'm going to read at least the Tango one because I picked it up. But I'm also interested in investigating Leonardo Padura and his work because based on what I've read so far, it definitely places itself very deeply in that atmosphere of Havana in the end of the 21st century or the 20th century. And I'm excited about being there. It feels very lyrical, and I think that's going to suit me just fine. Any last thoughts on Daniel Chavarria before we I do a couple 5-round burst reviews and then we wrap up?
Not really, I don't think, Justin. I wish I had a little bit more time to delve into his biography. As you mentioned, he has some colorful stories, but it's hard to tell what is exactly true. I thought I'd close with this quote from Chavarria about, when his childhood and sort of what inspired him to be a writer. And he says, this is from the Havana Times. He says, "At the age of 8, I was born as a storyteller on my grandfather's farm. During the harvest, there were a lot of seasonal workers, plenty of mate to drink, the campfire, and a storyteller, who could be anyone from a real gaucho to just a bum. In any case, I was dazzled by their stories." And he goes on to say that's what really inspires him to be a writer, the stories from his youth. And I don't know. I hope maybe he was told stories about prostitutes as a youth, but probably not.
Maybe he was told stories of all the wonderful prostitutes in Cuba, and that's why he hijacked a plane to get there.
There's worse reasons to hijack a plane, I guess.
Yes, there are. That is accurate. I think that if we had more time and energy, like we were two wealthy retirees, we could spend an episode talking about Cuban Noir generally, sort of contextualize it, tie it back to the early noir days of Dashiell Hammett before the revolution, and see what was out there. I know there's some work written in the 30s and 40s. I think a lot of it's in Spanish, and that's why I'm not focusing on it. I know that in 1971. There was a book put out by Ignacio Acuna, which was awarded a big award, I think, Spanish award, and it was inspired by American hard-boiled fiction. So I know there's even more stuff out there, and we could probably do a pretty cool chronology. But again, we get into that murkiness of not being able to handle it effectively unless we are fluent in Spanish ourselves. So I think for the sake of this episode, we've provided a few leads for you all out there, and go have fun with them and tell us what you think. And if any of you are bilingual and can offer some insight into what's going on in Cuba in terms of hard-boiled and crime fiction, both before and after the revolution, feel free to send us a note and give us some context, and we'll share that on the show next time.
Yeah, that sounds good. And look forward to episode 432 when we discuss all of those things in the year 2043.
Yes.
When we're, all of those things and have the time to do this. But no, I think we'll come back to Caribbean noir and a lot of the, hopefully Cuban noir again in the future. I guess I was also going to note before we close this out that I wanted to say that Chavarria was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award, basically. He got the Cuban National Prize for Literature in 2010. So his work was well respected in Cuba, both during and after his life.
Totally. Yeah, he won a lot of awards, and deservingly so, presumably.
On to some reviews.
Yeah, let's do a few reviews. I have 4 reviews, and I'm going to keep them quick and punchy. So, like I said, I attended the Left Coast Crime Conference in Albuquerque last April, and on the Hardboiled panel sat 4 gentlemen. Because for some reason they decided to cram a bunch of white males into the Hardboiled panel. It was in a way that reeked of conventionality, but whatever. There we were. One author was Matt Coyle, and he writes a series featuring a private investigator named Rick Cahill, who is operating in San Diego. It won a Lefty Award for Best Mystery Novel in 2020. The one I'm talking about is called Lost Tomorrows, and it's actually the 6th in this series. So I know nothing about this series, and I'm not a huge fan of San Diego for some reason. It's too clean. It's too nice. I don't know. Something about it rubs me wrong. But anyway, Rick Cahill, he left the Santa Barbara Police Department after becoming a suspect in the murder of his wife Colleen, which obviously leads to some psychological struggles with him. And he's trying to get vindicated for this crime. It wasn't him. How does he prove it? His former cop partner is then killed in a hit and run. So there's this sort of ramped up tension. It seems like there's some kind of conspiracy. It's clearly not an accident, right? So this is a sort of a conventional plotted novel. I'd consider it more of a thriller than a hard-boiled private eye novel. But I'd recommend it for those who like that kind of plot-forward commercial thrillers with flawed protagonists at their center. It was solid. One book I really liked, and I'm surprised to find it now because it would have been great for our Chicago Noir episode, is a book called The Last Striptease by Michael Wiley. This is set in Chicago, and this novel is sort of the story of a private investigator named Joe Kosmarski. And his job in the case of this novel is to clear a childhood friend of murder. This friend is named Bob Piedra, who is dating a Vietnamese American gal. This woman is found dead in an airport hotel, I think at the O'Hare Airport. And then there's this retired judge who believes that Bob is innocent. But this judge is also the same judge that gave Joe Kosmarski's dad a lot of shit, double-crossed his dad in the past. And his dad, I think, was a cop or something. It gets sort of convoluted, but the point is, I didn't read it for the plot. Sometimes I can't stand crime plotting. I just want to get to what the writer's trying to say. And in this case, this was all about Chicago atmosphere. I got a lot of the sense of Chicago. I got a lot of that hard-boiled, gritty feeling that I was really looking for in the Chicago Noir episode. And so that got me excited because this isn't the first book. This isn't the only book in the series. I also want to say that this book won the PWA SMP Best first private eye novel contest. So it was good, and I recommend it. And I'm going to I downloaded the second book to my iPod, or whatever it's called, my phone. iPods are no longer, I think they stopped,
this year.
They discontinued iPods.
That's right.
The end of an era. Okay, moving on. I don't give a shit about Apple. It's fine. I don't have to feel anything about that. So this third book I'm reviewing, Kenneth Wishnia, he wrote 23 Shades of Black. I think, Kurt, you reviewed his work a while back, but I just wanted to say,
yeah, I think I've reviewed this very book, so I'm curious to hear what you're going to say.
Okay, I'm going to say some things. So this is part of a 5-book series, and it's currently being released by PM Press, which used to be in Oakland, but now is in New York. 23 Shades of Black is socially conscious crime fiction. I put that in quotes. It's set in New York City in the gritty 1980s. And this is a novel that sort of focuses on a protagonist named Filomena Buscarella, who is a Ecuadorian immigrant and also an NYPD cop. So this is an interesting tension, especially because this is a socially progressive novel dealing with themes of class division and social division and environmental devastation. But the protagonist is a woman minority police officer with a very aggressive style. So I was curious to see how he handled that sort of central conflict. And essentially this book is about the main character, Buscarella, sort of awakening to the fact that policing, even though she sees it as a social good, ends up becoming something that doesn't work for her, that doesn't align with, her views of the world. But at the same time, she's attempting to sort of solve this convoluted crime about chemicals and environmental damage and this conspiracy that I didn't write down, so I barely remember. But I do remember the details. This book is hyper detailed. There's a lot of details about the East Village art and like punk rock scenes from the era. We go into punk rock clubs. There's a lot of like moments where there are like accidental druggings or like heavy alcohol use where characters end up like there's one moment where Buscarella is like tripping her balls off on a subway. I would say there's a lot to say about this book because it's really dense, but these kinds of books that are like a little bit overwrought or like trying to shove as much in as possible, they tend to scare me off sometimes. Like the writer can't stop adding detail. But in this case, for the most part, it was balanced. It was okay. It didn't drive me crazy. And it felt like I was really deeply immersed in this world with a funny and tough female protagonist, to the point that I know that she ends up leaving the force, leaving the NYPD in later on in the series. So I'm optimistic that the series is going to be something that holds my interest. So I'm going to read the other books. But I really liked this book. I thought it did a lot of cool different things that push crime fiction forward. So a fan of that one. And tell me what you thought.
Well, no, I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it. And I personally think the series gets better as it goes on. I haven't finished all of them, but I think I've gotten through book 4.
Okay, good.
I really like it. It's not one of my like all-time best favorite series, but it's in the, I don't know, top 20.
Okay. Well, that's great. That's given how much you read, that's a pretty significant number.
Well, yeah, I would if you have the time, I would recommend keep going with it.
I will do that. I bought the other one when I was at Left Coast. I picked up the second one in the series, so I'll give that a read. The last book I'm going to review is by Reed Farrell Coleman. It's funny, I actually read and reviewed this book twice, 3 years apart, and had no idea. Like one of those books where I was like, I read it, I listened to it on audiobook last month and 2 months ago, and then I went to go write down my review. I wrote it, and then I went to publish it on Goodreads and saw that I had already done it. And I was like, what the fuck? It was like I went through a wormhole of time. But then I saw, I had listened to it on audiobook in 2018. The funny thing is my review was almost the same. So a solid crime tale set in Long Island. It's called Where It Hurts. It's about an ex-cop who lost his son and then gets involved in trying to solve the death of another man's son who has ties to the crime world. Very simply, the story is well written and reminiscent of Dennis Lehane and Robert Parker. I did enjoy a lot of it. Not necessarily like groundbreaking because it reminded me of other writers, but it had that kind of grit and that kind of pathos and grounding that makes for an emotionally rich, mystery. So it definitely a hit. Reed Coleman is good at what he does. So that's it. Those are the guys that were on the panel, and I made a promise to read at least one of their books. I made this promise to myself, and there we go. I have. So now I can wrap up.
All right. Well, I've got two real quick reviews here, and then we can call it a show. I don't really have any extra books to read, but I have watched two TV series recently that I think listeners might be interested in if you haven't checked them out. That's Tokyo Vice on HBO Max and Slow Horses on Apple TV. I give a thumbs up to both of these. I think, Tokyo Vice is based on a book, supposedly a real life memoir called Tokyo Vice, an American reporter on the police beat in Japan by Jake Edelstein or something like that. I think the HBO series is pretty good. I think that there's some solid acting, especially from the Japanese cast. Do a really good job, which is good because the actor who plays Jake in this is not that strong. That would be a hesitation to this show. But basically it follows, he's a young kid who learns Japanese, gets this job as a journalist for a prestigious Japanese newspaper. He's the first Westerner to work there. Of course, that causes some problems. And he also asks questions that he's not supposed to ask, which leads to this investigation into the Yakuza and how they're connected to Japanese society. So through that, he creates these relationships with different people, including some women who work in hostess bars and some both straight police and corrupt police and some members of the Yakuza. And he attempts to tell those stories. Now, I kind of think this would have been better as a limited series, but they've left it hanging at the end of season 1. I don't know if there's going to be a season 2. Slow Horses on Apple TV is probably the better of these two shows. This one is a televised series based on the Slow Horses novel by Mick Huron,
Yes.
Which we've covered on the show back in our spy episode. And I really think this one is quite good. What Slow Horses is about is really in MI5, the British intelligence. There's a location where Slow House, where they send sort of the undesirable spies. Like these are where they're like, we can't let you go, but we don't want to keep you around. And so we're going to have you do things like sort through garbage and monitor, just dumb stuff. Anyway, in this show, which is updated a little bit from the novel to more current circumstances, basically there is a kidnapping and they end up a rather notable kidnapping, and they end up getting involved in the plot rather heavily. And like a lot of spy fiction of this type, not only is there the event going on, but then there's the internal power struggles going on within MI5 that are also playing a role. I thought this was really good. I think Gary Oldman plays Jackson Lamb, who's like the head of this group, and I think he does a really nice job. Kind of perfect for the role. Generally just a fun series if you like that kind of spy fiction thing, which really there's not that many out there. I think that there's a lot of sensationalized spy shows, but there's not that many that take it more on maybe a little closer to what it might actually look like. And I think this show does that. It's also, it's one of these split season things where the first half of the season is covering Slow Horses, and then there's a break. I'm not exactly sure when it comes back, but then they do book 2 in the series, will be the second half of series 1.
Cool.
So
that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Where is that being streamed again?
Slow Horses is on Apple TV.
Okay.
And Tokyo Vice is HBO Max.
Okay, cool. I happen to have both of those now, at least temporarily, so I might take advantage.
Well, sounds good. I think that's a show. So, Justin, do you want to let the listeners know, and me, because I forgot, what's next?
Yes, I'm just going to go through what I have, and you can stop me if you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Because I don't think we ever really solidified the next few episodes. So I'm just going to wing it. Episode 67 this was a Kurt desire, and we're going to fulfill it. We're going to hang out with B. Travin and read Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which sounds like a great thing to do during this hot climate change post-pandemic summer, Kurt. I'm excited about that.
Yes. Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so episode 68. I'm not sure if we talked about this or not, but we were talking about the writer Iceberg Slim, and we had expressed interest in reviewing one of his works, and I bought a couple of his books. This is like 70s, maybe somewhat blaxploitation, crime fiction. I haven't read it. I don't know a lot about it. All I know is that Iceberg Slim, which is a pseudonym, is sort of a pivotal writer of like crime fiction of the Black experience. One of those books that we might review is called Pimp. Kurt and I can sort of sort out and decide if that's what we're going to go with or not. But that's what I have written down, Kurt.
Yeah, I think I'm good with that one.
Okay, and then episode 69, and we'll stop previewing with this one. This is where we're going to spend time with Elmore Leonard, who 69 episodes into this podcast, we still haven't spent much time with. We haven't settled on a book yet. We asked a lot of our readers what book we should review for this episode, and we have a lot of great ideas, but we haven't actually sat down and tabulated what people want. But I know that Kurt, you and I, we probably both have 3 books that we're thinking of, and we'll come to some kind of consensus on that soon, I hope, and that should be fun.
There's a lot of good ones to choose from. I do think that, if I recall the suggestion, Swag had a slight edge.
Okay, so Swag's on the docket for now, but it's still to be negotiated. How do they contact us, Kurt?
Well, the best thing to do if you want to get in touch with the show is give us an email, pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook. I'm kind of taking a Facebook break right now, but we do have a group there, Facebook, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. There is one page for the show and then like a listeners group that gets not a lot of traction, but if you want to get in touch with with some of the other listeners, you can certainly post on there and chat about noir and crime fiction. As I said at the beginning of the show, we love it and appreciate it if you give us a review on iTunes. It is the biggest one. Even if people don't download their show from iTunes, they still take a look at those iTunes reviews. So we appreciate you listening, and we look forward to speaking with you, or you listening to us, or whatever you want to call it, again very soon. Have a good one.
Take care, everybody.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.